Bangladesh, A Legacy of Blood by Anthony Mascarenhas. Chapter 4 Mujib's Military Nightmare, Part 1. I don't want to create a monster like the one we had in Pakistan, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. The year 1973 started inauspiciously for Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. His first year in office had been one of frenetic effort and gloom relieved only by a single golden success. That was Bangladesh's first constitution. An imposing document enshrining the noblest values to which an emotional people could aspire, the Constitution had been masterminded by Mujib and piloted by him through the National Assembly. The task was completed on 4th November 1972, clearly a record for newly emerged third world states. After it was handwritten by a master calligraphist, the Constitution was signed and sealed by the middle of December. Bangladesh may have been ruled by a lame duck administration, but it had a constitution which any country could be proud of. Mujib was certainly proud of his handiwork. He had thereafter taken the next logical step on the road to orderly government. Elections had been set for 7th March 1973. It should have been a happy time for Bangabandhu and Bangladesh, but suddenly on New Year's Day, there was unbelievable violence on the streets of Dhaka. Chittagong and Khulna were also shut down by rampaging students. Crowds were stomping the streets of the three main cities, hurling abuse on Sheikh Mujib. It had started as a students' demonstration in Dhaka protesting the US bombing of Hanoi during the bloody days of the Vietnam War. A large crowd gathered outside the US Information Center and Library in downtown Dhaka. They were agitated, but no one anticipated a breach of the peace. It was generally assumed the students would move on after they had shouted their protest. Suddenly, however, someone provoked them to attack the building, and within minutes the crowd was involved in a fierce battle with police reinforcements who were hastily called in. The police opened fire, killing 2 students and injuring at least 6 others. In the circumstances, it was a disaster for Mujib. There was a special sanctity attached to students in Bangladesh because they have in the past been in the vanguard of the struggle for the people's rights. Mujib was one such student who had risen to leadership on the shoulders of the young men and women who had championed Bengali causes over the years: language, political rights, economic justice, and finally, total emancipation from Pakistan. It was, therefore, inconceivable that barely a year after the founding of Bangladesh, students should be killed in Dhaka by Mujib's police. The event was doubly significant in that it also marked the first outbreak of mass violence in Dhaka since independence. There had, of course, been a public airing of grievances in the capital 4 months earlier when Abdul Rabb, the left-wing students' leader, denounced Mujib for betraying the country. Mujib had dismissed it as a political stunt. The violence and shooting in the streets now was something more ominous. Mujib's instincts warned him that it was an attempt to undermine his position, and he became convinced of a plot when the trouble rapidly spread to Chittagong and Khulna, and left-wing student leaders, in an obvious attempt at a shutdown, called for a general strike. Mujib decided to take up the challenge. He may have been hesitant and unsure of himself in the Secretariat, but the streets were home ground to him. Accordingly, he took the fight to the students. First, he shut the door on criticism by ordering a judicial inquiry and making plain that he would not shirk his responsibility to protect foreign missions. Then, in a clear reference to the Soviet Union, he ordered his people to crush, quote, the agents of a foreign power who are trying to push this country into a certain bloc, close quote. Results were stunning. Within hours, at least 100,000 villagers armed with sickles and bamboo staves crossed the river to join up with members of the Awami League student wing in Dhaka. Together, they routed the left-wing mobs, first from the students' hostels, where they were entrenched, and then from the streets of the city. The defeat was so complete that Maulana Bhashani, the aging chief of the Marxist National Awami Party, hurriedly called off his own protest meeting and fled to the seclusion of his village. The left-wing leaders had badly miscalculated in attempting a head-on clash with Mujib. They had not realized that however much of the people suffered, there would remain in the Bangladeshi peasantry a reservoir of affection for the Bangabandhu. In a delta country subject to floods, cyclones, famines, and pestilence, people have learned to live with disaster. They take a lot of punishment so long as it does not intrude against their simple values, such as ownership of land, the sanctity of the family, Islam, their religion, and their pride in being Bengalis. The Pakistanis did not understand this in 1970 and 1971, when the Pakistanis denigrated the piety and the pride of the Bengalis and hunted down their youth. They provoked the heart of Bengali nationalism and were thrown out. In all this, Mujib had become the symbol of Bengali hope and pride, albeit in abstract terms, and would remain so for a long time, even though his policies were shattering the state. Mujib used this feeling with characteristic agility on this occasion to turn disaster into a resounding victory. The day's events had two significant results. First, it drummed into the heads of Mujib's opponents that they could never hope to topple him in a straight fight. Ultimately, such an assessment would be fatal for Mujib. Major Rashid, when asked why Mujib was killed and not deposed, replied, quote, "There was no other way. He had the capacity for mischief, and given the chance, he would have turned the tables on us." Close quote. The second had happier consequences for Mujib. Having demonstrated his strength by demolishing the opposition, he sailed through the elections 3 months later to his landslide victory. His Awami League won 307 of the 315 seats in the National Assembly. The other parties could not muster enough strength between them to be formally recognized as the opposition in the House. There were, of course, allegations made by some defeated candidates that the election had been rigged against them. Professor Muzaffar Ahmed said his faction of the National Awami Party would have won 25 seats but for intimidation, false votes, and other malpractices. Apart from one well-recorded incident where one of Mujib's ministers, Mr. Manan, unaccountably had an upsurge of votes at the close when the count had been going against him all day, these charges were not taken seriously by independent observers in Dhaka. Maulana Bhashani, an astute political weather vane, who had earlier come out against Mujib, after the election quietly fell into line behind the government with the remark that the election result, quote, was the signal for the arrival of undiluted socialism in Bangladesh, close quote. Sheikh Mujib understandably took the election result as a personal triumph and a vindication of his policies. Quote, "The result shows that my people love me as I love them," he told reporters. Thus, not only were the peasants for reform brushed aside by the pressures for reform brushed aside by Mujib, and the Awami League also saw their election victory as a license to press on as they had done in the past. The tempo of the Mad Hatter's dance in Bangladesh picked up perceptibly. One significant facet of the elections, not made public at that time, but which Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and his advisors took careful note of, was the pattern of voting by the troops. The government was disturbed to find that the votes recorded in the military cantonments had gone overwhelmingly against Mujib's Awami League candidates. I had heard a rumor to this effect during a visit to Dhaka in February 1974, but it was not till December of the following year, after Mujib had been killed, that I was able to pin it down. General Zia and Brigadier M.A. Manzoor told me that a little more than 80% of the troops had voted against the Awami League. Among the troops was a sizable proportion of men who had been in the forefront of the independence struggle when Mujib was both flag and father to his people. Now, 15 months later, they constituted the biggest single bloc against him. The reasons for this disenchantment have been advanced by Majors Farouk and Rashid, by Brigadier Manzoor, some other officers and Jawans, and by Major General Ziaur Rahman, the Chief of Army Staff himself. In an interview on 11 December 1975 in Dhaka after Mujib was killed, General Zia told me, quote, "We were really not an army and did not exist on paper. There was no legal basis for the army. There was no TOE, table of organization and establishment. Everything was ad hoc. The army was paid because Mujib said it should be paid. Our existence depended on Mujib's word. Our chaps went through hell and they suffered but did not complain because they were involved in serving the country and were willing to make whatever sacrifices that were necessary." On the same day, Brigadier Manzoor, Zia's Chief of General Staff, CGS, said, quote, "This is a volunteers' army. The officers and men are all volunteers because they chose the army as a career. What were they given in return? They were ill-fed, ill-equipped, and ill-administered. I tell you, they had no jerseys, no coats, no boots. They stood on guard duty in the cold at nights in their slippers with blankets wrapped around them. Many of our troops still are in their lungis and without uniform. Then there was the humiliation. Explaining this, Manzoor said, "Our men were beaten up by the police. The bureaucrats, as they had been in Pakistan, hated the army and they carried over their hatred when they came to Bangladesh. Once some of our boys were killed, 2 Jawans, privates, and we went to Mujib and asked that the people who did it should be punished. He promised to look into the matter. Then he informed us that the Jawans were killed because they had been collaborators." Close quote. According to Manzoor, Mujib had done his best to destroy the enemy. He had also adopted the policy of divide and rule, getting rid of anyone who seemed to be a threat to him. Quote, "It was he who divided the army into so many groups," Manzoor said. "He called them separately, giving one a promotion, another a perk. Things were done without reference to the chief of staff." Close quote. General Zia and Manzoor and some other officers I talked to suspected that Sheikh Mujib had been grooming his second son, Jamal, for a senior position in the army. According to Manzoor, after putting Jamal in the army, Mujib immediately sent him off for training at the Yugoslav Military Academy. Jamal, it seems, couldn't cope with the studies there, and to Mujib's great disappointment, returned to Dhaka. Thereafter, Mujib wanted him sent to Sandhurst. He, in fact, peremptorily telephoned General Shafiullah, who was then the Chief of Army Staff, insisting that Jamal be appointed a cadet at Sandhurst. This created a difficult situation all round. In the first place, cadets for Sandhurst are chosen by an exhaustive selection process, and there were many other candidates brighter and more suitable than Jamal, and it was thought that Jamal would not be able to meet the standards required by Britain's premier military academy. Secondly, Sandhurst did not cater for ad hoc appointments, but since Mujib insisted that he be admitted, they agreed to accept Jamal as a special case on payment of 6,000 British pounds sterling training fee. This was immediately agreed to, and according to Manzoor, the money was remitted secretly through army channels without the knowledge of the finance minister. Jamal was a likable lad, and unlike his abrasive older brother Kamal, was well behaved and respectful. Not long after returning from Sandhurst, and within a month of his wedding, Jamal was gunned down with the rest of the family when Mujib was assassinated by the majors. Mujib had an understandable hatred for all things military. He had suffered grievously at the hands of Pakistan's two military dictators, Field Marshal Ayub Khan and General Yahya Khan. Ayub had arrested Mujib on 7th of October 1958, the day he seized power. During the next 10.5 years of Ayub's dictatorship, Mujib had been jailed for long periods in solitary confinement. Then, in 1968, while once more in detention for political activity, he was made the principal accused in the notorious Agartala conspiracy trial in Dhaka. The charge? Conspiring with India for the secession of East Pakistan. It was a capital offense, and Mujib only escaped the gallows because a countryside upsurge against Ayub in 1968 forced him to drop the charges and bring Mujib to the conference table. While a prisoner of General Yahya Khan in 1971 during the Bangladesh independence struggle, Mujib had had an even closer brush with death. The story he told me was splashed on the front page of the Sunday Times. According to Mujib, he had been tried by a military court and found guilty of treason and sedition. On 15th of December 1971, the day before the Pakistan army surrendered to the Indian troops in Dhaka, General Yahya Khan had ordered Mujib's execution. A military team went from Rawalpindi to Mianwali, where Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was being held in jail. The team went about its task in a methodical manner. A shallow grave was dug in the cement floor of the room adjoining the Bangladesh leader's cell. He was told that this was being done as an air raid precaution. But Mujib knew what it was for and prepared himself for the worst. Fortunately for him, the ceasefire was ordered that night. The jailer, taking pity on Mujib and knowing that Yahya Khan was about to abdicate, smuggled him to his personal quarters where he kept him for 2 days. The operation was helped by the confusion that attended the surrender of the Pakistan army. When Zulfikar Ali Bhutto replaced General Yahya Khan as president, he refused to revalidate the execution order when asked to do so. 2 weeks later, Mujib was a free man and on his way to Bangladesh via London. He never forgot the jailer who saved his life. In June 1974, when President Bhutto visited Dhaka, Mujib invited this man along as his personal guest. Mujib carried his hatred of the army with him to the grave. This attitude was shared by his ministers and other senior Awami Leaguers who had also escaped death at the hands of the Pakistan army in 1971. To their basic hostility of things military was added, after independence, the fear that the Bangladesh army might try to supplant them. This anxiety was grounded in the fact that the Bengali military men had been in the thick of the fighting during the independence movement while the Awami Leaguers stayed safely in Calcutta out of the line of fire. As such, it would have been understandable if the army men with other freedom fighters had insisted on positions of influence in the new state. The army as an institution, at least, did not make this demand. It was content to let Mujib rule, and in the first 2 years of independence gave him loyalty and support. Mujib and his ministers, however, from the very start deliberately emasculated the role of the defense forces. Before he was 1 month in office, Mujib took the first step in this direction by signing a 25-year treaty of friendship and mutual assistance with India. The Indian army had helped to create Bangladesh, and it was to India that Mujib now looked to protect it from external aggression. The treaty thus obviated the need for an effective fighting force, and the country's defense establishment was reduced to a policekeeping and largely ceremonial role. Sheikh Mujib himself told me in February 1974 that he was against a powerful military force. Quote, I don't want to create another monster like the one we had in Pakistan. Mujib wanted the army to wither on the vine. but almost by accident, it didn't happen that way. During the Arab-Israeli War in October 1973, the Bangladesh government, anxious to make a show of support for the Arab cause, decided to make a gift of a plane load of the finest domestic tea to Egypt. In the absence of more tangible support with money and arms, the tea was at best a token gesture. But it did have the esoteric virtue of providing the hard-pressed Arab troops with refreshing rounds of the cup that cheers. The government was delighted when Egypt gratefully accepted the offer. Accordingly, a Bangladesh Biman 707 with a fragrant cargo took off from Dhaka on 27th of October, and after attempting a landing at Cairo airport, which was closed, was diverted to Benghazi in Libya, where it offloaded the tea. Coincidentally, the discharge of the cargo was watched with considerable interest by two of my colleagues from the Sunday Times who were stranded at Benghazi airport. Tea was the last thing on their minds. What they wanted was a lift to London, and they had heard that the plane would soon be headed in that direction. Captain Bill McIntosh, after checking with Libyan authorities, was happy to oblige. No one, least of all Sheikh Mujib, could have guessed that at that time that the gift would rebound with the most tragic consequences for him and Bangladesh. As it happened, President Anwar Sadat, after the war, remembered Bangladesh's unusual gesture and decided to make a handsome gesture in return. He knew Bangladesh had no armaments worthy of this name, and there were any number of T-54 tanks parked in the desert sands outside Cairo. President Sadat decided to make a gift of 30 of them to Bangladesh. The offer was conveyed to Mujib in the spring of 1974. It dismayed him. He was alarmed at the prospect of having such military equipment in Bangladesh. He did not want tanks. They did not fit in with his ideas about the army. The Foreign Office and his ministers, however, persuaded Mujib that he could on no account refuse Sadat's gift. The 30 T-54s with 400 rounds of tank ammunition arrived in Bangladesh in July 1974, making a very welcome addition to the army's strength, which was then built around all of 3 vintage ex-Pakistan army tanks left over from 1971 war. When they were ceremonially handed over to the 1st Bengal Lancers, Bangladesh's only armored regiment, one of the officers taking delivery of the tanks was Major Farooq Rahman. Though officially second in command of the regiment, he was the most experienced armored corps officer, and the tanks came effectively under his control. Thus, man and weapons were brought together, all because of a gift of tea. 1 year later, Farooq led the tanks to Mujib's house and changed the course of Bangladesh. But before that, Mujib tried to build an alternative to the army. The Jatiyo Rokhi Bahini, which roughly translated means National Security Force, was an elite paramilitary force whose members had to take oaths of personal loyalty to Mujib. Despite its high-sounding name, it was a sort of a private army of bully boys not far removed from the Nazi brown shirts. It was formed originally as an auxiliary force, a group of 8,000 hand-picked men from the old Mukti Bahini to assist the police in the maintenance of law and order. As opposition to Mujib increased, he founded a convenient alternative to the army, which he mistrusted, to be brought in wherever necessary to aid the civil administration. The Rokhi Bahini was raised to 25,000 men who were given basic military training, army-style uniforms, steel helmets, and modern automatic weapons. Its officers were mainly political cadres, and it was freely used to crush opponents and critics of Mujib and the Awami League. In time, it completely terrorized the people. There are several documented cases of murder and torture committed by the Rokhi Bahini. In May 1974, after a 17-year-old boy was found to have disappeared after 4 days of torture. The Supreme Court severely castigated the Rukki Bahini for operating outside the law. The court found that Mujib's stormtroops had no code of conduct, no rules of procedure, and no register of arrests and interrogation. Mujib's answer to the court's censure was to strip it of its powers to intervene in such cases. A feature of 1973, the second year of independence, was the expanding violence in Bangladesh. The upsurge of violence was in direct proportion to the increase in corruption, market manipulation, smuggling, and political repression by the cohorts of the Awami League who were savoring their election victory. The people fought back with guns carried over from the Liberation War. Gangs of dacoits roamed the countryside at night, looting granaries and village shops for food and everyday necessities. Mujib countered with the Rukki Bahini and by liberally arming his party men, many of whom were allowed to carry prohibited bore rifles and automatics. According to Brigadier Manzoor, who was the brigade commander Joshore at that time, the profusion of arms was caused as much by illegal arms cached after the war as by the Awami Leaguers' free access to the government armories. He said he was able to recover 33,000 weapons and 3.8 million rounds of ammunition from the 6 districts under his command. By the end of 1973, the total of politically motivated murders in Bangladesh had crossed the 2,000 mark. Victims included some members of parliament, and many of the murders were the result of intra-party conflicts within the Awami League. Most of the MPs and senior Awami Leaguers had their personal bodyguards. One of them, according to Dhaka journalists, was so insecure that when he went to his village, he not only ringed the house with armed followers, but also stationed others in every room. Quote, the bloody fellow even has a bodyguard in his bedroom, I was told. Dhaka, the capital, was not immune to the violence. An unofficial curfew was enforced after midnight when rickshaws, taxis, and private cars were checked and searched by the Rukki Bahini and police. One such incident, which vividly describes the scene in Dhaka in those days, nearly resulted in the death of Mujib's eldest son, Kamal. Kamal was a hot-headed, very abrasive young man who, like his father, had a proprietary attitude to Bangladesh. Criticism and opposition in Kamal's book meant anti-national activity, and Kamal was not above using a heavy hand to crush it. Sheikh Mujib, perhaps, did not like some of the things Kamal did, but nevertheless allowed the young man a free hand. A particular target of Kamal's venom was Siraj Sikdar, the leader of the Maoist Sarbohara Proletarian Party, who had fought the Pakistan Army during the Liberation War in 1971 and had then come out against Mujib. Sikdar and his men used to observe 16 December, the anniversary of Bangladesh's liberation, as a black day because they resented what they felt was a gift of independence by India. In 1972, Siraj Sikdar and his men had plastered the capital with anti-Mujib posters and graffiti and had set off bombs in police stations to mark the occasion. This year, when intelligence reports indicated they would repeat the performance, Kamal decided to prevent it. On the night of 15 December, he and his cronies, armed with Sten guns and rifles, went out in a microbus hunting Siraj Sikdar. They were not aware that the special branch of the Dhaka police under Superintendent Mehboob had received similar orders from their chief. Their paths crossed during the course of the hunt. The police squad under Sergeant Kibriya in an unmarked Toyota car noticed the armed group in the microbus and decided to follow it. Kibria thought he had come upon the Shikdar gang. Kamal in the microbus, for his part, thought Shikdar's men were in the Toyota. The showdown came opposite the Bangladesh Bank headquarters in the Motichil area of the city. In the exchange of fire, Kamal was hit in the neck, the bullet narrowly missing his windpipe and jugular vein. With blood spurting from his wound, he jumped from the microbus, shouting, "Don't shoot! I'm Kamal! I'm Kamal!" When they realized their mistake, some of the policemen rushed him to the postgraduate medical college hospital. The panic-stricken Sergeant Kibria, meanwhile, fled to the bungalow of the Deputy Commissioner of Dhaka, Mr. Abdul Hayat, where he told him, quote, "We have made a terrible blunder and brought heaven down upon our heads." Hayat was an experienced officer and realized that heads would roll because of this blunder. After making sure that Kamal was still alive, he lost no time driving to Bongo Bhavan for an immediate audience with the Bangabandhu on a matter of the greatest importance. Mujib's reaction on hearing the news surprised the deputy commissioner. "Let him die," he said, clearly furious that Kamal had once again taken the law into his own hand. When Abdul Hayat asked what he should do about the policemen, Mujib told him to return them to duty. "They have nothing to fear," he said. "It is a matter of record that on that occasion at least Mujib kept his word." My friend Zakaria Chaudhry, Zach, who recounted the story, saying he had got it firsthand from the deputy commissioner, told me Mujib refused to visit his son in hospital for 2 days. When on the day after the incident, Zach called at the hospital, Begum Mujib was very distressed and told him in Bengali, "Bhai, he has come to have such a big head that he doesn't come to visit his own son, who is dying." The fact is that Mujib was becoming increasingly embarrassed by Kamal's behavior. I know of several occasions when he remonstrated with him about his freewheeling ways. Then, paradoxically, he also indulged Kamal and sent him on political errands or to work among the various student groups. As such, Kamal was never far from the throne. On this occasion, father and son were soon reconciled. When Kamal left hospital and had fully recovered, he was temporarily taken out of political work and given the task of organizing a series of football tournaments. It was hoped that this would keep him out of mischief, while at the same time giving the people something to take their minds off their problems. Among the angry young men in the Bangladesh army were two young majors who took immense pride in their professional competence and who now found their careers on the rocks because of Sheikh Mujib's studied neglect of the armed forces. One was Farooq Rahman, second in command of the 1st Bengal Lancers, the country's only tank regiment, which till the middle of 1974 had only 3 obsolete tanks in its armory. The other was Khandakar Abdur Rashid, the commanding officer of the 2 field artillery, also based on Dhaka. Farooq and Rashid, both born within a month of each other in 1946, were good friends and brothers-in-law since they had married the daughters of Mr. S.H. Khan, who belonged to Chittagong's leading industrial family. Mr. Khan's older brother was A.K. Khan, a former industries minister in the Pakistan government. A single wall separated their bungalows in Dhaka cantonment, and in the evenings the sisters and their husbands would often get together, as they put it, to pass the time. It was these family ties that allowed them to confide in each other about their disenchantment with the way things were going in Bangladesh. The two majors were otherwise poles apart in terms of personality and came from very different backgrounds. Farooq, his full name is Dewan Isharatullah Sayyid Farooq Rahman comes from the upper crust of Bengali society and claimed that on commissioning he was the first second-generation Bengali officer in the Pakistan Army. His father's family are known as the Pirs, religious leaders of Rajshahi, claiming direct descent from Arab Sayyids who had settled on a modest estate in Noga. His mother belongs to a land-owning zamindar family of the Jamalpur, Islampur area of Mymensingh, who claim descent from Turkish soldiers of fortune under the Mughal emperors. Between them, Farooq was closely related to Dr. A.R. Mullik, former finance minister and university vice-chancellor, Syed Nazrul Islam, acting president of Bangladesh while Mujib was in jail, Syed Ataur Rahman Khan, former Chief Minister of East Pakistan and Prime Minister of Bangladesh, and Major General Khalid Musharraf, who was very briefly Chief of Staff of the Bangladesh Army in November 1975 before being killed in the Sepoy Mutiny. Farooq's father, Major Syed Ataur Rahman, was an army doctor, and Farooq's education reflects the pattern of his postings. He crisscrossed the subcontinent 6 times in 13 years, starting off in the Fatima Jinnah Girls' School, Kumilla. Farooq jokes about his one and only time in a convent. He went to Abbottabad, Burnhal, Dhaka, St. Joseph's, Quetta, St. Francis Grammar School, Rawalpindi, Station Road School, where Field Marshal Ayub Khan's daughter Naseem was also a student, Dhaka Adamji College, ending up in a college in Kohat for a crash course in maths. Farooq was the eldest of the 3 children. He has 2 sisters, and it was not intended that he should go into the army. His love of flying got him a solo license at the age of 17, and he had unsuccessfully tried to join the Pakistan Air Force. So the family got him admitted to Bristol University for a course in aeronautical engineering, and he would have gone to the UK in 1966, but for the intervention of hostilities with India in the spring of 1965 over the run of Kutch. Caught up in the prevailing patriotic fervor, Farooq, on his way to college, stopped off at the Inter-Services Selection Board office in Kohat and volunteered for a commission. A week later, when the call came, there was initial disapproval from his mother, who didn't want to lose her only son to the army. But Farooq, with his father's consent, finally made it to the Pakistan Military Academy at Risalpur, where he quickly distinguished himself by becoming Battalion Sergeant Major. When he graduated 4th of 300 officer cadets, he was given his choice of service. Farooq chose the Armored Corps. Quote, "I don't want to do foot slogging in the army," he said, politely turning down suggestions by Majors Ziaur Rahman and Khalid Musharraf, then instructors in the PMA, that he should join the Bengal Regiment. Instead, Farooq was appointed to the 13th Lancers. Later, Farooq transferred to the 31st Cavalry, then based at Sialkot, and in 1970, at the age of 24, he found himself a captain, acting squadron commander of Charlie Squadron, and in the command chain of the Armored Corps. This significant career opening was made possible by his success in the Tactical Armored Corps, which he topped with B+. In October 1970, Captain Farooq Rahman received a note from his CO informing him that he had been selected for secondment to the oil-rich Sheikhdom of Abu Dhabi, where Pakistan was involved in training and servicing the Sultan's armed forces. Farooq has no idea why he was chosen for secondment, but the fact remains that at the beginning of 1971, when the political upsurge was getting underway in East Bengal, Farooq found himself a squadron commander in the Abu Dhabi Armored Regiment based near the oil port of Jabal Dhana. It was a happy time for the young tank commander, military duties in which he exalted took up only a portion of his time. He had lots of it left for his other loves, reading volumes of military history and tactics, driving fast cars and music. Farouk bought himself the best stereo system he could find and an Opel Commodore GS in which he would tear along the desert roads at 100 miles per hour. He was billeted in the British officers' mess, and it was there that in the middle of June 1971, he found a bundle of British newspapers, among them the Sunday Times, featuring my massive expose of the Pakistan Army's campaign of genocide in Bangladesh. It marked the turning point in his life. As Farouk put it, quote, "What actually convinced me about your writing was your technique and reporting. The way you wrote about those Pakistani officers straight away struck me that this man is not a fraud, only a chap who has been in close touch with the Pakistan Army, knows exactly how they behave. I know, and I also know that no one can simulate it. That's why I was solidly convinced that this chap knew exactly what he was writing and couldn't be wrong. This forced me to decide to go." Close quote. I asked Farouk, quote, "Would you have gone if you had not read the article?" He answered, "As I said, I was not interested in politics because I was rising very fast professionally with the little service that I had. I was only interested in seeing how fast I could go. I was only interested professionally in being a general officer. Then suddenly this thing came to me and disrupted my whole damn career." Confirmation of the disaster that had staggered the Bengalis came in a letter from his uncle, Nurul Qadir, a Bengali civilian officer who had fled to Calcutta to join the Mujibur government. Farouk is an ardent nationalist. He is also single-minded, with decisiveness grounded on careful planning. After carefully weighing the situation, Farouk decided he could no longer serve in the Pakistan Army. On the 12th of November 1971, he packed a bag and drove to Dubai airport, where he abandoned his car. Then he caught the first flight to Beirut and London for the long journey to Bangladesh. Farouk saw Farida for the first time when panicking with Major Rashid and his wife, Tinku, on the Kaptai Lake near Chittagong. Farouk was instantly smitten by the younger sister's beauty, refinement, and quiet charm. "I want to marry her," he told Rashid in the matter-of-fact manner they conversed with each other. "You must arrange it." Rashid did the needful. Farouk and Farida were married on 12th of August 1972. After the marriage, Farouk and Rashid became inseparable. The majors first met in the Pakistan Military Academy in Risalpur. Farouk belonged to a senior batch, but it did not matter. The Bengali officer cadets, who were heavily outnumbered in the academy by Punjabis and Pathans, sat together in the cafeteria to chit-chat, as Rashid tells it. Rashid was very talkative, Farouk a good listener. Like Farouk, Khondakar Abdul Rashid's own presence in the military academy was the result of the effusion of patriotism during the Pakistan-India War in 1965. Rashid came from the tiny village of Chaiparia on the road between Kumilla and Daudkandi, where his father was a primary school teacher of modest means. He is not connected to the great or the learned, and is the first to deny Bangladesh gossip that he is a nephew of Khondukar Mustaq Ahmed, the Awami League minister the two majors installed as president after the knocking off of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Rashid insists that the only connection with Khondukar Mustaq is an accident of geography. They come from the same sub-district. Rashid was studying soil science, geography, and geology at Dhaka University when the war broke out in 1965, and he thought it was a patriotic duty to seek a commission in the Pakistan Army. He was selected, and after a run-of-the-mill showing in the PMA, graduated 92nd in his class. Rashid requested posting to the Bengal Regiment, but instead was given his second choice, and commissioned in the 2 Field Artillery then based in Bannu in the northwest frontier province. In 1968, when promoted to captain, Rashid went to Dhaka on a short holiday and lived with an uncle. He was an eligible bachelor, and his uncle's friend had a very eligible niece, Zubaida Tinku, the elder daughter of S.H. Khan of the Chittagong industrial family. The match was arranged, and Rashid took his bride back with him to Bannu, where the first of their 2 daughters was born. For a brief period in 1970, he was posted to the East Pakistan Rifles and stationed at Khulna, where he was employed in policing the border with India. One day, he caught an NCO with rupees 100,000 in his pocket. The man had evidently obtained a big bribe from the smugglers operating in the area. Rashid promptly arrested him. His action was not appreciated by his commanding officer. Rashid says this man, a Punjabi, but was also involved in making money from the smugglers. Later, when he caught some gold smugglers red-handed, Rashid suddenly found himself back to his artillery unit. The excuse, he was to learn later, was a secret report by his CO that he had, quote, developed parochial tendencies. In the military jargon of that time, this meant that he was a Bengali nationalist. It was a bad certificate for any Pakistani army officer. When the Pakistan army cracked down on the Bengalis in March 1971, Rashid's unit was stationed in Hajira on the Pakistan side of the ceasefire line in Kashmir. It was a trying period for the young Bengali officer. The radio reports he was picking up from different parts of the world gave horrifying stories of the trauma in East Pakistan. Rashid decided to defect from the Pakistan army. Explaining his reasoning, he said, I thought that once the movement had started, whatever the cause may be, and right or wrong, it had to be seen through to the end. If we fail to liberate our country when we could have been tremendously subjugated by the Pakistanis, they would never have treated us like human beings again. We therefore had no choice. It became a duty of every Bengali to fight for his country's liberation so that we could live independently with honor and respect. Like millions of other Bengali women at that time, Tinku rallied bravely behind her husband. The country comes first, Rashid recalls her saying. Other things are not important. We must go. To break out of their isolation in Hajira, Rashid applied for a 10-day furlough on the excuse that his parents were ill and he had to see them. After an agony of waiting, his request was granted, and on 2nd of October 1971, he took Tinku and their baby daughter to Dhaka. Rashid sent his wife and child to her parents in Chittagong and himself tried to cross the border into India at Agartala. Twice he was nearly caught in the crossfire. The third time, on 29th of October, he slipped through. He re-entered East Pakistan through Sylhet at the beginning of December with a Mukti Bahini howitzer battery attached to Ziaur Rahman's Z-Force. After independence, this battery was raised to a regiment. The 2 Field Artillery and Major Khandakar Abdul Rashid became its commanding officer. Farooq and Rashid, like the other Bengali officers and men involved in the liberation movement, the Bangladesh army itself, had high hopes for Bangladesh after its creation. They were proud of their country, extremely nationalist, and the fact that they were willing to take a back seat in the first years of independence clearly shows they had no political ambitions. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, however, did not see it that way. His bitter experiences in Pakistani jails made him suspicious and hostile to all things military. In his anxiety not to recreate the monster he had known in Pakistan, he ended up doing that very thing, and it destroyed him.